Let's discuss now some of the processes by which, in the late 19th century, more and more of the American economy was dominated by a smaller and smaller number of larger and larger business enterprises. This is a business world that consumers today are relatively familiar with, in which many industries are dominated by a relatively small number of relatively large firms. A world of Coke and Pepsi, a world of Nike and Adidas, a world of Apple and Samsung. These patterns spread in the late 19th century in a variety of American industries. And there are basically two business processes by which an industry that was previously dominated by lots of small firms winds up under the control of a relatively small number of relatively large firms. Horizontal and vertical integration. Horizontal integration is a relatively simple process and in some ways isn't the most interesting of the two. Horizontal integration means that two or more businesses that do the same thing merge. And you saw a wave of these mergers in a variety of industries in the late 19th century. Under a variety of business forms. Businesses might form cartels or trusts or holding companies or other kinds of corporate structures that made it possible to merge companies into one larger business enterprise. But you also see a great deal of vertical integration in the late 19th century, and this is the more transformative process. Vertical integration is the process by which more and more stages of the production of a product, from raw materials to the actual product on the shelf, come under the control of an individual company. Let's talk about a few examples of industries that were transformed by vertical integration in the late 19th century. If it's 1840 and you're enjoying a steak in Boston, I hope that that was recently a cow that was alive near you in Boston, shortly before it was turned into a steak. But in the late 19th century in Chicago, one of the industries that transformed Chicago into an industrial powerhouse was a vertically integrated meat packing industry, where two companies in particular, Armour and Swift, centralized the production of meat in large factories in the Chicago area. And they integrated vertically backward into owning their own sources of cattle, forward into marketing their own products with their own brand name, shipping their products around the country on their own refrigerated rail cars, such that by 1900 it was possible to buy nationally branded meat, the production of which had come under the control of a single vertically integrated company. And these processes spread throughout the consumer economy in the late 19th century. Frequently, they came along with developments in new kinds of continuous process manufacturing machinery. Here, for example, is one of the most innovative consumer products of the late 19th century, the cigarette. This is something called the Bonsack machine. This is a continuous process machine, which means that a properly running Bonsack machine allows you to pour a large amount of, quite frankly, probably relatively low quality tobacco in one end of the machine. And cigarettes come out the other end very, very quickly and efficiently. This has an impact on how you sell tobacco. The way to profit from the sale of tobacco in a situation like this is through volume. There is a relatively high initial investment necessary to build the machine, to build the factory. But once you've invested that initial chunk of money, the actual raw material cost per cigarette is quite small and is a relatively small overall percentage of the cost of the whole enterprise. And so the way to profit through this is volume. And the tobacco industry in the late 19th century integrated vertically, and one of the things they did is that they integrated forward into their own sales and advertising and marketing. Before the invention of the Bonsack machine, most Americans who were addicted to tobacco consumed it in handmade forms. They smoked cigars, or they chewed tobacco, or they smoked a pipe. And the tobacco companies realized that they basically needed to teach consumers that this was an acceptable way to be addicted to tobacco. And so the tobacco companies were quite innovative in their advertising. The earliest baseball cards were not associated with the bubblegum industry, they were associated with the tobacco industry. These are cards advertising Old Judge cigarettes from the late 1880s. And the tobacco companies were concerned that American men, who were the dominant tobacco consumers at the time, would think that cigarettes would be insufficiently masculine a way to be addicted to tobacco. And so you see them in their advertising try to allay those fears. And the earliest baseball cards were tied to the tobacco industry. An example of a consumer industry that came into being largely because of the emergence of this kind of continuous process machine technology combined with vertical integration was consumer film. This is an ad for the use of the Kodak camera. In the 1880s, the Eastman Kodak Company figured out a way to spread light-sensitive, photosensitive chemicals on an endless loop of celluloid in a continuous machine process. This made it a lot easier for people to take photographs. Previously, photography had been a relatively skilled, relatively difficult thing to do. But once Kodak had invented this film process, in order to profit from that, they needed to convince a nation of Americans that they needed to be taking pictures recreationally. And so Eastman Kodak integrated forward from the manufacture of film into the manufacture of cameras. The Kodak Brownie camera was literally a cardboard box with a hole in it that contained a roll of film and a relatively simple mechanism to open and close the lens. And so Eastman Kodak advertised to convince Americans how and when and under what circumstances they should use photography. These ads are similar in some ways to ads you've probably seen advertising Apple products when the iPod and the iPhone came out. The earliest Apple advertisements for those products just showed people enjoying them and showed you why your life was not as pleasant as it might be if you had purchased this product. This is very much the same kind of advertising. As an indication of the degree to which entrepreneurs by the 1880s and 90s thought of the American rail network as efficient and as national, is that the original business premise of the Brownie camera around 1900 was that consumers would buy the camera loaded with film, and they would expose the film, and then they would ship the entire camera still loaded with film by mail back to upstate New York. And Eastman Kodak would mail back their prints and the camera refilled with film. They eventually shifted to a different distribution model, but the fact that it occurred to them that that would be a reasonable way to convince more and more Americans that they could take their own pictures gives you some idea of the nature of the transformations in the economy that we're talking about. With respect to sporting goods, this was also an industry that was transformed in the late 19th century as the result of some of these business processes. Albert Spalding had been one of the best pitchers of the 1870s, but he retired from baseball relatively young to go into two businesses. One was the business of owning baseball teams rather than playing on them, but the other was sporting goods. And he started with a storefront in Chicago, and through a process of horizontal integration, merging with other sporting goods companies, and vertical integration, integrating backward into the production of his own products and forward into marketing and advertising. By 1900, Spalding Sporting Goods was essentially the trust in control of the sporting goods industry in the United States. This is Spalding's Baseball Guide from 1889. This was where the official rules were printed every year. It gave you a summary of the previous baseball season. It contained that year's editorials from Major League Baseball about what was going on in baseball and why they were the legitimate leaders of the game. And then in the back were ads for a variety of Spalding sporting goods. This kind of mass production, mass distribution, nationally advertised economy is in core ways more or less the consumer economy that we live in today. And this emerges in the United States in the last quarter of the 19th century. And so one of the most obvious and most important consequences of these industrial changes was an economy more and more filled with high volume, relatively low price, relatively low marginal profit. That is, the profit per item was relatively low. Mass-produced, mass-distributed consumer goods, cigarettes, sporting goods, cameras, processed foods, and a variety of others. This image is an advertisement for Montgomery Ward. Montgomery Ward was one of the two leaders in the catalog industry, the other one being Sears. And they had the business idea that you could buy virtually anything from Montgomery Ward by mail. You would mail them the money, they would mail you the product. Sort of the Amazon.com of the 1880s or 1890s. And the catalog industry was like a lot of American industries by the late 19th century, that it had grown not usually monopolistic. A monopoly is where one company controls the entire industry. That happened in a few industries like oil, for example, or tobacco. But in many industries, what you got was not total monopoly, but oligopoly, a relatively small number of competing firms. Sears and Montgomery Ward, Armour and Swift in meat. And this advertisement for Montgomery Ward is in many ways a summary of this lecture. In this advertisement, they've peeled away the walls of their skyscraper in Chicago, showing you the bureaucratic organization through which they efficiently move goods to you. And in one of these departments, people are opening letters and taking out orders and taking out money, and they send the money to one department and they send the orders to another. You probably have presidents and vice presidents in nice corner offices in the taller part of the building up at the top. And then the advertisement also reminds you that they're vertically integrated. They're showing you the factories that they use to make some of their products. They're showing you what kind of a distribution network they have to bring it to your door. This image gives you a pretty good idea of what kinds of transformations have taken place in the consumer economy in the last quarter of the 19th century.